Story 1. The last train never came. I arrived at Marlow Station just before dusk, the air sharp with the chill of early autumn. It had been abandoned for decades, but something about the quiet isolation drew me in, like a whisper I couldn't quite catch. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I approached the platform. Sky was bruised purple, and fog rolled in thick waves over the rusting tracks. I shivered, not entirely from the cold. I paused at the edge of the platform, noticing the remnants of human life. Chipped benches, a shattered ticket booth, and a faded timetable board. It felt like the station was waiting, silently, for a train that would never come. My flashlight's beam cut through the mist, illuminating nothing more than still shadows. The overpass stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed. From up here I could see the full stretch of the tracks disappearing into fog so thick I couldn't see 10 feet ahead. My pulse quickened. No trains had passed here in decades, but the air seemed charged. Then a faint creak echoed behind me, like a door slowly swinging open. I spun around, but the platform was empty. I descended slowly, trying to convince myself it was the wind. But then I heard it, a whisper, "Don't go." The words weren't carried by the wind. They were deliberate, soft, but heavy, as if pressed directly into my mind. I froze, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. Shaking, I walked toward the old ticket booth. The shattered glass glinted like jagged teeth. I felt eyes on me. I glanced down the tracks, and for a heartbeat, I swore I saw a shadow flicker, like a figure stepping onto the platform, but when I blinked, it was gone. I decided to explore the waiting hall. Broken wooden benches lined the walls, covered in a thin layer of dust. The fog had seeped inside, curling at my feet like ghostly tendrils. I could hear the wind tapping against the broken windows, but beneath it was something else faint, rhythmic, like footsteps echoing behind me. I turned sharply. The hall was empty. The sound stopped. My heart raced. I whispered to myself, "It's just the wind," but I didn't believe it. The station felt alive. I moved toward the old platform again. The fog had thickened, wrapping the rails in a near-white haze. I heard another whisper, softer this time. "Stay." It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Goosebumps prickled my skin. I could feel the temperature drop, my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight. I reached the edge of the tracks, peering into the fog. For a moment, I thought I saw a train, faintly glowing, appearing through the mist. But it wasn't a train. It was a shape indistinct, almost translucent, hovering over the tracks. My legs went numb. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure seemed to pulse with a light of its own, pale and cold. The shape moved closer, gliding rather than walking. My mind screamed that it wasn't real, but I felt the pressure of its presence, heavy, insistent, like water pressing on my chest. I stepped backward, tripping over the edge of the platform. My flashlight skittered across the ground, illuminating its face for a fraction of a second. Hollow eyes, impossibly pale, and an expression that was neither angry nor sad, but expectant. I scrambled to grab my flashlight and ran toward the waiting hall. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, matching my own. But no one was there. I reached the hall and pressed myself against the wall, breathing hard. The station was silent again. Then I noticed the old benches were not in the same place as before. One had been moved slightly, angled toward me. My pulse raced. I whispered, "Okay? Maybe this place isn't empty." I walked cautiously back to the platform, determined to see the figure clearly. The fog clung to my clothes, soaked into my hair. When I reached the edge, the shadow was gone. Only the rails stretched into nothingness, yet I could still feel it, the presence, just beyond perception, waiting. A sudden cold gust hit my face, spun, and for a second, I saw a small figure at the far end of the platform. It looked like a child in a faded uniform, eyes hollow, staring at me. Then it vanished. I decided to explore the overgrown trackside. I could make out the outline of an old signal box. Inside, dust covered everything. To get on the floor, there were footprints, not mine, not wet, not fresh, but they hadn't been there when I entered. They led to the edge of the fog. I stepped back toward the platform, trying to convince myself to leave. My ears caught whispers again, names. Hundreds of names murmured in unison, rising and falling like a chant. I froze, heart hammering. The voices weren't outside, they were in my head. A sudden flash of movement, a figure on the rails, motionless, yet somehow watching. I shone my flashlight fully. The figure was pale, almost translucent, wearing the uniform of a long-forgotten railway employee. It tilted its head as if studying me. The air around me thickened. It felt alive, oppressive. I backed away slowly, but its gaze followed me. Then, faintly, I heard the clack of train wheels on rails, slow, deliberate, approaching from nowhere. I spun. No train. Only fog. Yet the sound grew louder, echoing inside my skull. I ran to the ticket booth to hide. My flashlight flickered. When it came back on, I saw a faint handprint on the glass, smeared with dust, though no one had touched it. I felt an undeniable pressure in the room, like invisible hands pushing, urging me toward the platform. I stumbled back outside. The fog had thickened, nearly blinding. I could hear whispers all around me, rising into a crescendo, names, warnings, cries, repeating, "Don't leave, stay, wait." My legs felt like stone. Something cold brushed past my hand, soft, insistent, yet there was no one there. I made it back to the platform's center. A shadow emerged from the mist, figure impossibly tall, cloaked in darkness, its face featureless. I froze as it drifted toward me. My instincts screamed to run, but my body betrayed me. The figure stopped mere feet away, and I felt a presence in my mind, cold, patient, and waiting. The fog shifted. For a fleeting second, I saw the platform alive again, passengers waiting, a train glinting under a sunset long gone. Then the vision dissolved. The shadow remained. I stumbled backward, nearly falling off the edge. The whispers returned, now urgent, chaotic. "Run, run, stay." They covered my ears, screaming at the emptiness, but the voices persisted. Something tugged at my ankle. I looked down. Nothing. Yet the sensation remained, cold and firm, as if I was tethered to this place. I ran for the overpass stairs. The structure groaned. Shadows flickered across the walls. I thought I saw a dozen figures following me, all pale and hollow-eyed. Every instinct told me to keep moving, but I glanced back. The shadow at the center of the platform hadn't moved, but now it seemed. Angrier, I tripped on the final step, hitting the concrete floor. My flashlight skidded, illuminating empty air, and then a child's pale face inches from mine. Hollow eyes. Its mouth opening, whispering something I couldn't hear, yet somehow understood. It waits. Scrambled to my feet and ran. Toward the parking lot, toward the safety of the road beyond. When I reached the lot, I dared to glance back. The platform was empty, silent, dead. No shadow, no figures. It's only the crumbling remains of the station. I felt relieved. I told myself it had been my imagination. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak in my house sounded like the station doors. Every shadow reminded me of hollow eyes. Friends laughed it off, but I knew better. Something waited there, patient, and it remembered. I went back once, months later. Tracks were gone, reclaimed by weeds. But when I walked past the ticket booth, I felt it again. A presence, pressing lightly against my mind, whispering softly, not words, just a feeling. You can't leave me behind. I left the town soon after. I tried not to think about it, but sometimes in the quiet, I feel the cold tug of unseen hands. The faint echo of footsteps on gravel, and the soft, sorrowful whisper, "The last train never came, and neither did you." Even now, the memory lingers. Some places don't let you go, and some ghosts are still waiting for their passengers. Story 2. The Office That Refused to Sleep. I never believed in ghosts. Not until that night. My company sent me to an abandoned city office building for what they called a routine clearance and inventory check. The place had been empty for years, a modern relic left to decay. My job was simple: check for any structural hazards, catalog the old furniture, and report anything unusual. Little did I know how unusual it would get. The moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the building greeted me with a wave of stale, cold air. It smelled of mildew and the phantom scent of long-ago brewed coffee. The fluorescent lights in the vast lobby flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to cling to the corners like living things. Yellowed, curling papers were scattered across the floor, and the crunch of broken tiles under my boots was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. I started my work in the main office area, a frozen sea of cubicles stretching out before me. A thick layer of dust coated everything: toppled chairs, grimy keyboards, forgotten mugs. As I bent down to pick up a stack of old invoices, a sudden icy draft brushed the back of my neck. I froze. The main doors were closed tight. The HVAC system had been shut down for years. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the old building settling, the wind finding its way through a crack, but the chill didn't leave. It clung to my skin like a silent warning. I decided to check the break room next, hoping a change of scenery would calm my nerves. As I stepped through the doorway, the stainless steel door of a large refrigerator creaked open on its own, slowly, deliberately. My heart started pounding against my ribs. Before I could even process that, a drawer slammed shut in the kitchenette area across the room. My mind was screaming for a logical explanation, a loose hinge, but my gut told me something else. The air grew thick, heavy, as if it was aware of me, watching my every move. Returning to the main office floor, I saw it. The papers I had just stacked so neatly on a desk were now scattered wildly across the floor, as if a child had thrown them in a tantrum. The beam from my flashlight trembled in my hand. "It's just drafts," I whispered out loud, the words sounding hollow and unconvincing even to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was here. Something was watching, testing me, maybe even learning from my reactions. The building had a second floor, and my job wasn't done. I found the stairwell, the air growing colder with each step I took. The metal steps groaned under my weight, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence. As I reached the landing, a door slammed shut on the floor above me. The sound was so sharp, so violent, it made me jump. A moment later, it slammed again, and then again, louder each time. The booms reverberating through the concrete structure. My attempts at rational thought were faltering. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't the building settling. This was something else entirely. At the end of the upstairs hall was the manager's office. Unlike the rest of the floor, it looked almost untouched by time, preserved under a thin layer of dust. As I stood in the doorway, a stack of papers on the large mahogany desk began to shift, rustling as if stirred by an invisible hand. I took a hesitant step inside, and in an instant, the papers flew off the desk in a sudden violent flurry, landing scattered at my feet. I swept my flashlight beam across the room, my heart hammering. There was nothing. No open window, no vent. But the presence. I could feel it. A cold, intelligent weight in the air. That's when I heard it. Soft, distinct footsteps echoing from the hallway just outside the office. A low, vibrating hum started to resonate through the walls, a sound I could feel in my teeth. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. And then a whisper right beside my ear. It was sharp, sibilant, and full of malice. "Leave." Stumbled backward, spinning around to face an empty room. I fled back into the hall, and my blood ran cold. The cubicles, which had been in neat, decaying rows just minutes before, had been rearranged. The chairs were no longer facing the desks. They were all turned to face me, arranged in a silent, watchful semicircle. I was trapped, surrounded by an unseen intelligence that was making its presence terrifyingly known. Panic finally took over. I bolted for the stairs, my only thought to get out. But as my feet hit the steps, they felt like they were alive, trembling and shifting beneath me. Back on the ground floor, the elevator doors, long deprived of power, began slamming open and shut. Again and again, the metallic crash, echoing like a mad drumbeat. Papers lifted from the floor and desks, swirling into the air around me in miniature tornadoes. It was like the Poltergeist was playing with me, a cruel game to test the limits of my fear. I ran down the main hallway, yanking on every door I passed, hoping for another way out. They were all locked, sealed tight. Suddenly, I felt the unmistakable touch of cold, slender fingers brush against my arm. I spun around, shouting into the darkness. Nothing. There was nobody there. The air was thick with a palpable sense of anticipation, as if the building itself was leaning in, savoring my terror. Every object, every shadow seemed to be moving with a single malevolent purpose. Desperate, I remembered seeing a small, unmarked door near the back of the lobby. It led to a narrow service staircase that went all the way to the roof. I scrambled up, the air growing colder, until I burst through the rooftop door. Snow was blowing in through broken skylights, the wind biting at my exposed skin. The rooftop was empty, but the chaos continued. Discarded office supplies, loose shingles, even old letters floated in the air, spinning and dancing in the frigid wind. I felt the presence press in on me from all sides, a tangible force that felt intelligent and impossibly cruel. There was a fire escape. I threw myself toward it, my boots clattering on the rusty metal as I scrambled down the side of the building. From inside, I could hear a faint sound carried on the wind laughter. It was distorted, high-pitched, and almost childlike, and it echoed from the empty floors below. As I descended, papers began to fall from the windows above me, not dropping but floating, drifting unnaturally before finally touching the ground. The poltergeist's influence wasn't just limited to the objects inside, its reach was everywhere. When my feet finally hit the solid pavement of the street, I ran without looking back. Only when I was a block away did I dare to stop and glance over my shoulder. The office building stood silent and dark against the winter sky, looking as empty and lifeless as it had when I first arrived. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. Even now, months later, when my route takes me past that street, I feel it. A cold spot in the air, the distinct sensation of being watched. I know it's there, waiting, remembering me. Some presences I've learned aren't bound by walls. The worst part is, it didn't stay there. Sometimes, when I'm at home, alone in the quiet of the night, I'll hear it. Soft knocks from the other room, pen rolling off my desk when nothing touched it. And sometimes, if I listen closely, I can hear a faint whisper on the edge of hearing. Not finished. Not finished. I can't explain it. That building is still alive in my memory, and its ghost, its poltergeist. It took a piece of me with it. Thanks for listening. If you have a story you can't explain, share it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more unexplained encounters. Story 3. Something was living between the walls. I took the assignment because no one else wanted it. The hospital administration called it a structural inspection. Nothing paranormal, nothing dangerous. Just an old underground storage wing that hadn't been accessed in years. Connected to the hospital by a service corridor most staff didn't even know existed. That should have been my first warning. The elevator that led down wasn't on any public floor plan. You needed a physical key and a passcode that expired every 12 hours. When the doors slid open, the air smelled wrong, stale, damp, and layered with something faintly organic, like dust mixed with breath. The doors closed behind me with a sound that felt final. The corridor stretched on, longer than I expected. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, some flickering just enough to make the shadows move when I wasn't looking. Concrete walls, exposed pipes, and storage doors lined both sides, each marked with faded labels. Archives, surplus, decommissioned equipment. It felt less like a basement and more like something that had been buried on purpose. I tried to reassure myself. Hospitals are old, complicated places, layers built on top of layers. Forgotten spaces are normal. Still, every step I took echoed too loudly, as if the corridor were empty, but listening. My task was simple: inspect for water damage and structural weakness. That was it. I opened the first storage room. Empty shelves, dust thick enough to leave footprints. It's nothing unusual. The second room smelled faintly metallic. The third was colder than the corridor outside, and my breath fogged briefly before fading into the stale air. By the fourth room, I realized something deeply unsettling. The air wasn't still. It moved not like a draft, but like something adjusting around me. Subtle shifts in pressure, gentle, almost intentional. As if the space itself was aware of my position within it. I paused, listening. There were no footsteps, no voices, just the low hum of distant hospital machinery far above. And then something else. It sounded so soft I almost dismissed it. A slow, irregular scrape, like skin brushing against concrete. Somewhere inside the walls. I pressed my ear to the cold surface. The sound stopped instantly. Didn't fade or drift away, it just stopped. I laughed quietly to myself. Old buildings make noise, pipes shift. Rodents get into places they shouldn't, but rodents don't stop moving the moment they're noticed. I made a quick note on my clipboard and continued down the corridor. That's when the lights behind me flickered just once. And when I looked back, the corridor seemed longer, Not visibly different, just wrong. As if the distance between the doors had subtly stretched. I didn't like that thought, so I ignored it and pushed forward. The central storage wing was larger than the others, its ceiling lower, its lights dimmer. Old medical equipment sat covered in white sheets, their shapes unfamiliar and vaguely human in silhouette. I stepped inside. Temperature dropped immediately, not dramatically, just enough that my skin noticed before my brain did. Goosebumps crawled along my arms. The door behind me clicked shut. I hadn't touched it. I spun around, grabbing the handle. It opened easily. Relief washed over me, short-lived, but genuine. Then I noticed something else. The sheets covering the equipment were shifting. Not falling, not fluttering. They were adjusting, as if whatever was beneath them was breathing. I took a step back. The movement stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. I whispered, "Hello?" The word sounded wrong in that space. Too loud, too intrusive. Nothing answered. I told myself I was tired. The dim lighting and isolation were playing tricks on my mind. I documented the room as fast as I could and moved on. But as I stepped back into the corridor, I felt it again, that subtle pressure shift. Like walking through a room where someone had just stood up. The scrape returned, louder now, closer. This time, it came from above me, inside the ceiling. I stared up at the concrete panels. Hospitals don't put crawl spaces above underground storage corridors. There was no reason for movement up there. The scraping traveled forward, matching my pace as I walked. I stopped. It stopped. I swallowed hard. Whatever was in the walls wasn't random. It was responding. I tried to radio the surface team, static. I tried again. Nothing. My phone had no signal. That wasn't unusual underground, but it didn't help my growing panic. I turned back toward the elevator. The corridor behind me looked the same, except the lights were dimmer now. And the doors, some of them were slightly open. I was certain they'd all been closed before. As I passed one open doorway, I felt it. Sensation, not a touch, but a displacement. Like air being pushed aside just inches from my skin. I flinched away. Inside the room, the shelves were bare. But the scrape echoed again, louder, closer. Then came something worse. A sound that almost resembled breathing, but not from lungs. It was more like air being forced through narrow, wet gaps. Slow, patient. I backed away from the doorway. The sound followed. I started walking faster, then faster still. The corridor seemed to resist me. My steps felt heavier, as though the floor itself had softened. The lights flickered again, but this time in sequence, turning off behind me one by one. It's not failing. Following, I broke into a run. I reached the elevator alcove and slammed the call button. Nothing. The doors didn't open. The scrape now came from all directions. The walls, the ceiling, the floor surrounding me, without revealing itself. I felt a pressure against my chest. Not physical weight, but presence. Like standing too close to something vast and unseen in the dark. Then the whispering began. It wasn't words. It was patterns. Rhythms that felt almost like language, brushing against my thoughts without ever settling into meaning. Images flashed in my mind that weren't mine, hands pressing against walls from the inside. Bodies stacked in silent hallways. Panic, then deep silence. The hospital above me, over decades of suffering and fear, compressed into sensations rather than memories. I realized then that this thing wasn't a ghost, wasn't human. It wasn't even pretending to be. The walls bulged slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that I felt the space narrowing around me. The scrape became a glide. I felt something pass behind me, close enough that my skin prickled with an unnatural cold. I screamed. The sound was swallowed instantly, absorbed by the corridor itself. I dropped my clipboard and ran, not back toward the elevator. Forward, deeper into the maze. Instinct screamed at me that escape wasn't behind me anymore. The corridor ahead twisted subtly, bending where it shouldn't. Corners appeared that I didn't remember. Doors led to rooms I was sure hadn't been there before. The map of this place in my head was unraveling. The place was rearranging itself, or maybe it was just revealing what had always been there. I burst into a room larger than the others. No shelves. No equipment. Just bare concrete, and the unmistakable impression that this was where it gathered itself. The air vibrated. The whispering intensified. I felt watched from every surface at once. And then I understood. It didn't live in the walls. It was the space between them. The entity didn't appear. It didn't need to. I felt it press closer, not to harm, but to understand. To map me, my shape, my reactions, my fear. Its goal wasn't to scare me, it was to become aware of me. I dropped to my knees, completely overwhelmed by the sensation of being cataloged, piece by piece. Then suddenly, it withdrew. The pressure vanished. The lights stabilized. The corridor behind me returned to normal, and the elevator doors slid open. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled inside and slammed the button. As the doors closed, I saw the walls ripple not violently, but gently, like something settling back into place after a deep breath. The elevator rose. The familiar hum of hospital life returned. Voices, footsteps, normalcy. I collapsed against the wall, shaking. The administration didn't question my report. They sealed the storage wing permanently. No more renovations, no more inspections. The official reason was structural instability. I didn't argue. Weeks passed, then months. I tried to forget. But sometimes in quiet rooms, I feel it again, that subtle pressure shift, that sense of being slightly displaced, as if the space around me is adjusting, learning. Hospitals have layers, not just of concrete, but of experiences, emotions, panic, waiting. I think something formed in those layers over time, not a spirit, not a monster, accumulation. A presence that exists where things are pressed too tightly together for too long. I avoid enclosed spaces now, elevators, hallways, anywhere the walls feel too close. Because sometimes when it's very, very quiet, I hear the scrape again. Not nearby, but curious. The thing beneath the hospital didn't chase me out. It didn't need to. It learned what I was. And I'm not convinced it stayed behind. Some places don't become haunted. They become aware. And once they notice you, they never forget the shape you left behind. Story 4. The church that never locked its doors. This church was never officially abandoned. It's what made it so unsettling. It still had electricity. It still had rows of pews. It even had candles that someone or something replaced every few months. But no services had been held there in over 20 years, and no one could tell me exactly why. I came because the property records needed updating. The land was about to be sold, and my job was simple. Take some photographs, get some measurements, and write a general condition report. I arrived just before sunset. Thick fog clung to the hillside, wrapping the old church in a dull gray veil. The building stood completely alone, its stone walls darkened by age, its steeple cutting into the low clouds like a warning. The front doors were unlocked. They always were. The air inside was colder than outside, but it wasn't a damp cold. It was a deliberate cold, like the temperature had been lowered on purpose. My footsteps echoed through the nave, the sound stretching on, lasting longer than it should have. Rows of wooden pews faced the altar, all of them perfectly aligned. Dust covered everything except for the center aisle, which looked disturbed, as if people still walked it, even though no one ever came here anymore. I told myself it was probably just animals. I didn't believe it for a second. I turned on my flashlight, even though the overhead lights still worked. The stained glass windows depicted saints whose faces had faded with time. In the dim light, their eyes seemed darker than the rest of the glass, like they were watching me. I stepped toward the altar. That's when I heard it, breathing. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't close, but it was there. I froze. The sound continued slow, shallow, uneven, like someone trying not to be heard. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the immense space. The breathing stopped. Not faded away, stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I approached the altar cautiously. Candles sat unlit, with wax pooled thickly at their bases. The pulpit Bible lay open, its pages yellowed but perfectly intact. I hadn't touched it. But when I looked again, the pages turned. One, then another, slowly, as if guided by unseen fingers. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The church creaked, not the sound of an old building settling, but the sound of movement. Wood groaning where no weight should have been. I felt watched, not judged, but observed, like something was studying my presence rather than reacting to it. I moved toward a small side chapel. The door resisted at first, then swung open easily. Inside were rows of old confessional booths. Dust lay thick on the floor, except for one narrow path leading to the far booth. As I watched, the curtain twitched. I stood completely frozen. Then, from inside the booth, came a whisper. It wasn't words, just a soft, quiet exhale. I backed away. The curtain stilled. And then the bench right behind me scraped loudly across the floor. I spun around. One of the pews had shifted several inches out of alignment. There were no drafts, no vibrations, just movement, intentional movement. My flashlight flickered. When the beam steadied, I noticed something I hadn't before. There were fingerprints in the dust. Not fresh, old, layered, hundreds of them, all over the pews, all facing the altar. I decided I'd had enough. I tried to leave, but the front doors wouldn't open. They weren't locked, they just wouldn't move, as if they were fused to the frame. The overhead lights dimmed slightly, and that's when I heard the footsteps from the balcony above me. Slow, measured, approaching the railing. I looked up. A figure stood there. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't transparent either. It had just enough shape to suggest a human outline. It didn't move, it didn't gesture, it just watched. I didn't feel any immediate threat, only a deep, unsettling sadness that pressed into my chest. The air grew even colder. My breath started to fog in front of me. The figure drifted down the stairs without touching them, stopping halfway. I realized then it wasn't approaching me, it was positioning itself, blocking paths, guiding my movement. I moved sideways, and the figure adjusted its position. It always maintained its distance. It was always watching. The church seemed to respond to it. The lights dimmed where it passed, the wood creaking softly in acknowledgement. This wasn't a haunting. This was an occupancy. Then a second presence emerged near the altar. And then a third. Fainter. Less defined. They didn't interact with each other. They only interacted with the space. And with me. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes. Images started to surface in my mind. Church services from long ago. Crowded pews. Whispered prayers. A deep grief that had soaked into the wood and stone. And then abandonment. Silence. Waiting. These figures weren't threatening me. They were mourning. The church wasn't abandoned by accident. It had been left behind, and something had stayed to remember what was lost. Suddenly, the front doors creaked open behind me. There was no sound that prompted it, no signal. It just felt like permission. I didn't hesitate. I backed toward the exit, never turning my back on the figures. I just watched. The doors closed gently behind me as I stepped outside. Out in the night air, the fog had thickened. The church stood silent again, its dark windows reflecting nothing. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear breathing, but I felt something watching me through the walls. My final report was short, structurally sound, interior intact. No signs of vandalism. I didn't mention the moving pews, the figures, the fingerprints in the dust. The land was never sold. Every potential buyer backed out for what they called personal reasons. One mentioned feeling unwelcome. Another said the church just felt occupied. I sometimes pass by that hill at night. The church lights are on, always, even though no one pays the electricity bill. I think the doors remain unlocked on purpose. Not to invite people in, but to remind whatever is inside that it hasn't been sealed away, that it's still waiting. Some ghosts linger because they're angry, some because they're lost. One stayed because the place itself needed to be remembered. The church doesn't want visitors, it wants witnesses. And once you've been inside, it remembers you too. Thanks for watching. If you have a story about a place that remembers, share it in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more explorations into the unknown. Story 5. The market closed, but something stayed. The market was supposed to be empty. That was the word everyone used. Empty, even though no one had stepped inside for nearly 10 years. The city shut it down after structural issues and a growing number of safety complaints. Vendors were relocated, entrances were sealed, and the building was left to rot while paperwork crawled through the system. I was sent in to document what remained before demolition. It was early evening when I arrived, the sun low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the cracked parking lot. The market building loomed ahead wide, squat and windowless in places, like something designed to contain noise rather than welcome people. The side entrance was already unlocked for me. That should have bothered me more than it did. Inside, the smell hit first. Old produce. Rust. Dust. A faint, lingering sweetness that had no right to still exist. The main hall stretched out in front of me, a cavern of forgotten commerce. Rows of empty stalls, metal shutters pulled halfway down, signs still hanging from the ceiling advertising prices from another decade. My footsteps echoed too loudly, bouncing off the high ceiling and coming back slightly. Delayed, I stopped walking. The echoes didn't stop right away. It was a subtle thing, just a half beat too long, a ghost of a sound trailing mine. I stood perfectly still, listening. The building creaked faintly, settling under its own weight. Somewhere deeper inside, metal tapped against metal slow, irregular. I told myself it was just loose fixtures, the building breathing its last. But that explanation didn't hold for long. As I walked farther in, I noticed that some of the stall shutters were raised higher than others, not evenly, not randomly. It looked as if someone had opened them to different heights, peering out from within. I approached the first stall, a former fruit stand. Old crates lay stacked behind the counter. A digital scale sat on the surface, still plugged in, its display dark. When I stepped closer, the scale flickered on, just for a second. A flash of garbled numbers. No power source should have been active in here. I took a quick step back. The display went dark again. I crept forward, slowly. Nothing. It was only when my foot crossed an invisible line that it came back to life. I was triggering it. I continued down the main aisle, a deep unease growing with each step. The air felt thick. Not humid, not hot, just resistant, like wading through something unseen. A plastic bag skittered across the concrete floor ahead of me. I glanced around, no breeze. It slid a few feet until it hit a stall leg and stopped, crumpling in on itself. Then it moved again. I froze. The bag lifted slightly as if pinched by invisible fingers, then dropped. Behind me, a metal shutter rattled violently, a sudden, angry noise in the dead quiet. I spun around. 3 shutters slammed upward at once, stopping hard against their frames with a series of metallic bangs. The sound echoed through the market like a warning. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Hello?" I called out, hating how small and thin my voice sounded. The word bounced around the vast space, returning fractured, distorted. Something responded, not with a voice, but with motion. Crates toppled in a stall to my left. Then, a shopping cart rolled slowly out from behind a pillar, stopping directly in my path. It's perfectly centered. This wasn't random. The movements were too precise, too intentional. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the cart. As I moved, it rolled forward, matching my distance. Not chasing, following, testing. I tried to sidestep it to get around. A heavy crate flew from a nearby stall and slammed into the floor right where I would have stepped. I jumped back, breath catching in my throat. This poltergeist wasn't violent. Not yet, but it was controlling the space, learning how I moved, how I reacted. The market felt less like a building and more like a game board I'd just been placed onto. I turned and looked toward the exit, a distant square of fading light. The overhead lights flickered and then went out in sequence, starting near the door. Darkness advanced toward me, one light at a time. I ran. As I sprinted down the aisle, stalls erupted on either side of me. Shutters slammed open and closed in a chaotic rhythm. Scales rattled. Loose signs swung violently. But objects weren't being thrown at me, they were being arranged. Clearing paths, blocking others. It was guiding me, forcing me deeper into the market. I skidded to a stop near the old meat section at the back. The temperature dropped sharply, the air biting cold. Hooks hung from metal rails overhead, empty but swaying gently, as if still cooling from their last use. A deep hum vibrated through the floor beneath my feet. Then, the carts began to move. One by one, they rolled out from between stalls, from the shadows, forming a loose, silent circle around me. I stood frozen, my chest tight. The carts stopped at equal distances, their wheels locking simultaneously with a soft click. Crates stacked themselves near the edges of my new prison, sliding into place with deliberate care. The poltergeist wasn't chaotic. It was organizing. A memory surfaced then, a feeling that wasn't my own, the pressure of crowds pushing through aisles, the shouts of vendors, exchange of money and goods, 1,000 hands and voices layered upon each other. Then frustration, arguments, panic, a sudden collective fear that had soaked into the very concrete and steel of this place. I realized then that the market hadn't just closed, it had broken. The energy of all those people, all that life had been trapped here when the doors were sealed. The hum grew louder. The metal hooks clinked softly overhead. A crate lifted into the air in front of me, rotating slowly, then set itself down again. Not to hurt me, to show me, look what I can do. I finally found my voice, whispering, "I'm leaving." The market responded instantly. Every shutter slammed down at once. The sound was deafening, a final percussive roar. The cart surged forward several inches, then stopped. A clear message, not yet. The lights flickered back on, but dimmer now, casting distorted shadows that stretched and bent unnaturally. The shadows moved even when nothing else did. I felt watched from every direction at once, not by eyes, but by attention. I took a tentative step back. The floor vibrated beneath me, just slightly, like a warning tremor. I stayed still. The vibration stopped. The poltergeist was training me. It was teaching me the rules of its game. Slowly, I lowered my clipboard to the floor and stepped away from it. Nothing reacted. I exhaled and edged toward a narrow gap between the stalls. A crate slid aside, opening the path. Permission. I moved carefully, every step measured. Around me, the market adjusted objects shifting just enough to maintain control. I wasn't escaping. I was being escorted. The exit doors finally came into view. As I approached, the carts behind me rolled backward, returning to their original positions. Shutters lifted. The lights brightened slightly. The market was loosening its grip. The doors opened without resistance. I stepped outside into the cool night air and didn't stop walking until I reached my car. When I looked back, the building was silent, again dark, empty, harmless. Lying. My report was brief. Interior unstable, unsafe conditions. Recommend immediate demolition. The demolition never happened. Budget issues, delays. Then came the complaints from nearby residents about noises at night. They say carts move on their own. That metal shutters rattle when there's no wind. That lights flicker in strange patterns. No one goes inside anymore. I think the poltergeist learned something that day. Not about me, but about how to interact, how to control, how to wait. Markets are built for movement, for exchange, for crowds. When all that energy has nowhere to go, it doesn't just disappear, it reorganizes. Sometimes late at night, I hear the sound of metal rolling on concrete in empty spaces. I picture carts lining up in the dark, practicing. The market closed, but something inside it is still open, still arranging, still waiting for the next crowd. Thanks for watching.